Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are. Welcome to our April OpenNTF webinar. My name is Howard Greenberg, and my co-host today is Graham Akers. We have a multi-international cast of presenters today, presenting from, I think, Italy, UK, the US, and Canada. And so we're going to go ahead and get started. But before we get started much further, Graham wanted to, and all of us here at OpenNTF wanted to say a few words about somebody we lost last week. Graham?
Yeah, so Nathan Freeman, I think many people in the community know. Nathan was one of the co-founders of OpenNTF. And sadly, he passed away last week from cancer, which came as a bit of a surprise, I think, to practically everybody in the community. In terms of his impact on our community, I think there's probably almost nobody who's using Notes and Domino today that hasn't either seen a piece of his code or seen a presentation that Nathan made or talked to him at a user group event or whatever. And so it's a bit of a loss for everybody. As it turns out, his family had fallen into some financial difficulty just lately. And so we're sharing a GoFundMe link here on the page if anybody's able to help his family out. We had a brief memorial last week that everybody in the community was welcome to join, and we were able to talk to his wife and children. They are healing, and we plan to stay in touch with them going forward. But anyway, we wanted to just make note of the fact that that was a pretty big loss for us all, and we're thinking about Nathan and his family.
Thanks, Graham. And I really, I think the outpouring from the community to help out Nathan's family has really been outstanding. So it's really, I think it shows what kind of community we have and the friendships we've developed over the many years. So for those of you who helped out, thank you. And if you can't help out, that would be great. So just a little how we do the webinars. Most of you who have attended one of our webinars before know. There's a questions pane in the GoToWebinar interface. And so please ask your questions there. Don't put them in the chat, but ask your questions there. And at the end of the webinar, we'll answer your questions verbally. So we're not going to respond to your questions in the questions pane. And also, please keep your questions related to the topic we're discussing today, Domino administration. So if you have any unrelated questions, we do have a Slack channel for OpenNTF. Please, come join us. We'd love to have more participation there. I'd also like to thank our sponsors, in particular, two of them. HCL has been very generous with their sponsorship, as well as Prominic, who donates all the servers and the admin work and a lot of other things to us. So big thank you to those organizations, as well as all the other volunteers who make OpenNTF work. We are a volunteer organization, so if you want to help in some way, even if you're not developing a project that gets contributed, there's always people looking to do testing activities or administration, or just help throw out ideas or take the organization moving, keep the organization moving forward. So if you want to get involved, come to our Slack channel and let us know. We'd love to have your help and get to know you. Next webinar, just have TBD here, but we are thinking of pulling together a webinar on some of the more popular OpenNTF projects, kind of do a little snapshot of where they are and kind of level set everyone, because some of our projects are quite popular. Okay, I think we are ready to start the admin presentation. Heather, I'm going to make you the presenter, but Roberto is our first speaker. And I didn't actually properly introduce everyone. I think I kind of skipped the agenda slide. We have three presenters today, Heather, Roberto from Italy, Heather's from the US, and Serdar's from the UK by way of Turkey. And then helping us with our Q&A, we're going to have John Paganetti from HCL. So go ahead, Heather, Roberto, and Serdar.
Are you able to see my screen?
Yeah.
Yes, we do.
Okay, perfect. All right, Roberto.
Thanks. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. So let's start with some of the best practice tips and tricks. First of all, there's the slide on the server platform, and you might say, what's the best practice on the platform? Well, actually, no, there is no best practice. The best practice is use what you are familiar with. If you are a Windows shop, you don't want to use Domino on AS400. But I highlighted one platform specific, which is Docker, because we did a webinar on Docker and we gave some tips on that. Docker is very useful to create very quickly servers. For test or development, you need to set up a server for someone to develop an application, etc. And Docker is the easiest way to do that. Then you can scrap the server when you don't need it anymore. So even if you're not familiar with Linux, if you have the chance, my suggestion is have a look at that, because Docker and containers in general are becoming more and more popular, more and more products around Docker. So having a look at that could be helpful for your Domino administration. Next. So file system structure. Well, the recommendation is to have separate drives or directories, if you can have separate drives, for Domino program and Domino data. I suggest not to install on Windows in the default location, C/program files. I believe that there's a special place in hell for the guy who invented the directory names with spaces in the middle. But anyway, I don't do it. And I also try on Linux to avoid the brand name directory /opt/ibm/opt/hcl. I suggest you to use the KISS rule. I assume you all are familiar with the acronym. So, for example, on Windows, C Domino, D Domino that. One important thing in a big environment is consistency. I mean, once you decide your structure, use the same for all the servers. Don't install servers on one in C Domino and the other in D Lotus Domino or something like that. Keep consistency, please. Next, naming structure. Unless it's really needed, just use an organization and do not use organizational unit unless it's needed, because it makes administration simpler. And it's, I would say, based on my experience, is good for 90% of the cases. Obviously, there are customers that are a big organization and they want to use organizational unit. Good, perfect. The suggestion here, it has to be thought out very well before you implement it. You may decide to have organizational unit based on geography. For example, in Lotus, we had our servers and our people were with the city name. My ID was Roberto Boccadoro /MIL, which is Milano, /Lotus, which was fun because the people in Westford were like John Paganetti /WTF/Lotus. And anyway, or you may want to have the organization like sales, marketing, etc. Whatever you decide, decide it and stick to it, because it's really, really not very easy to change it once you've started with an organization and the organizational unit. Document the certifier password. It happens sometimes that I got a call from a customer. I have to renew an ID. Yeah, here is the cert ID. I can't remember the password. Not good. So, and keep it stored in multiple places, not just on the admin hard drive. Otherwise, if his PC get lost or whatever, you lose the password. So basic security options. Set the certifier expiration to 100 years. Default is 10, I think. But you don't want to have 10 years after you created your organization and your certification structure to have to recertify everything. I mean, 100 years is a good time to let the certifier expire. Then it's someone else's problem, I mean, to recertify everything. It's not your problem. Next slide.
Yeah, actually, Roberto, if I can just make a little comment there. In the past year, I have had 2 pretty good sized Domino infrastructures come to me because of problems with their O certifier. You know, when they were created back in the 90s, one organization, they created it for 25 years. And so here we are 25 years later, their O's expiring, and we had to recertify everything in their environment. Now, luckily, that environment, they knew their O password. The other client that reached out to me, their O was expiring and they had no clue what its password was because they used OUs. They had taken the rule that was back in the 90s where you created your O and then you put it in a safe place, like locked it in a physical safe on a floppy disk or whatever. And unfortunately, because of personnel changes over the years, nobody was around anymore that knew that O password, and we wound up having to recreate all of the IDs in their environment: certifiers, O certifier, OU certifiers, servers, users, etc. And let's just say it was not a fun project. So definitely don't repeat those mistakes.
Next.
All right.
It's yours now, Heather.
Thank you. So, basically, as Roberto was saying, Domino gives you a lot of flexibility in terms of selecting a platform to install on. And when you actually go in forward and install the Domino server, whether it's the first Domino server in your environment or a new Domino server, relatively easy. You run the install script, you run through the configuration, and boom, you have a Domino server. Well, yes, you have a Domino server, but there's definitely things that you want to do with the configuration so that you ensure that you have a Domino server that not only is secure, but also is going to run at optimal performance. And of course, the performance thoughts are going to be around what exactly that server is being used for. Domino can be a mail server, it can be an application server, it can host people using the Notes client, and it can also host web browsers. So you have to think about this Domino server possibly as a web server, which brings in a lot of other configuration around security and performance. So that's what we're going to walk through today. Of course, thinking about your Domino server's configuration, you need to think about where these documents or where these settings are stored. And the heart and soul of any Domino server environment is the Domino directory, names.nsf. So we're going to start by looking at those documents in the address book. Specifically, starting with the server document. Now, I have slides that speak to these. However, I would prefer to actually go into the actual server documents and show them to you live. Now, I have here a server that was created. This is just a test server, and so it's pretty much bare bones at this point. Okay, but overall, the first thing I want to point out about these documents is the field level help. I have to say that this field level help is something that really helps me quite often, especially for settings that I don't deal with all the time. But if you just simply mouse over and do a left mouse click, you get pop-up help that gives you information about that field and some considerations on maybe what you want to consider selecting or putting in as a value. Now, specifically, the other thing too is with a lot of these settings that I'm going to go over today, they're not things that you necessarily have to do right out of the box, okay? But they are food for thought, the things you want to consider, especially as your Domino server grows. Like, for example, this one here, load internet configurations from server internet site documents. I love this option for one, a Domino server environment that is a web server, or more specifically, is a web application that's spanning multiple servers. So when you have Domino servers that are loading their web configuration from an internet site document, from an administration perspective, it's easier to maintain and more sustainable because you have one document that you're needing to make your changes on for security and other settings. So another thing to keep in mind, though, is that when this gets changed to an enabled value, you have fields on the server document that disappear. So especially if you're ever looking at another environment, or if you've inherited a Domino server environment and you're going and wanting to make changes and you're like, oh my gosh, I knew that setting was here on the server doc. Well, look at your internet site load option, because possibly this is set to enabled and you have to go to the internet site document to make those changes now. One of my other favorite ones is, as an administrator, you know, those of us that have been around for a while, remember the days, you know, 10 plus years ago where you would get that page in the middle of the night, the Domino server's down. Well, now Domino has what's known as like a self-healing, in that it can actually do recovery when a panic or a fault occurs. So first of all, one that I definitely recommend turning on is the NSDs to collect diagnostic information when the server events. And by doing this, Domino is going to write out information to a text log that then afterwards can be reviewed by either yourself or HCL technical support, determine what happened, why did the server fail, and take any corrective action that needs to be done. Now this one right here, as an administrator who used to get woken up in the middle of the night, I love this one, because if the server has a fault, and then it runs an NSD, I can now say, also, go ahead and bring yourself back up so that my users can start getting the data that they need to do, the server can do the functions it needs to do, but I don't have to be bothered at that point in time. And then also, because we don't want the Domino server to get into a restart loop if there is something really inherently wrong that does require a person to actually mitigate, that's where you can say, I want that to set, if so many faults occur within a certain time period, then just leave the server down, stop coming back up. And finally, at server startup time, I can say, send an email to this set of people to, you know, for example, I can define here a mail group so that when the server comes back up, you get that email so you know the server experienced a fault, and you can then go look at that diagnostic information that was written out to the NSD and take any corrective actions that need to occur. Security, I could talk about all day long. I love security, but I'm going to try to keep it brief. So first of all, with regards to our security tab, I want to mention just how important it is to use groups versus explicit user or server names, just like any access control list, whether we're talking about a database access control list or a server access list. And it doesn't matter the system, you know, whether we're dealing with like a Windows Active Directory or the Domino directory, you want to use group names here. And not only does it allow for easier administration and maintenance in the future, but also some of these fields in this document, the values are stored at server startup time. And what that means then, if you need to add or remove an entry, rather than just simply modifying the group, if you're modifying the value on this document, that's not going to be refreshed on the Domino server until that server is restarted. So use groups, make that modification to the group, and as a result, by the server in a couple of minutes when the server refreshes or its cache, then either those rights are extended or the rights are revoked as they need to happen versus having to actually take an outage. Full access and administrators. These are two fields that I see in environments that a lot of times when I look at them for the first time that they are set incorrectly. First of all, servers are not administrators. You should never list a server or a Domino server group here. And also, you really want to think about who is a full access administrator in your environment versus who is an administrator. They both provide different level of rights. So full access administrators, that is the highest level of administration. And when somebody is a full access administrator, not only do they have a higher level of rights, but also they need to invoke those rights. And that at that time is then written out to the server log file and can be audited in terms of what was done while somebody had full access administration turned on. And when full access administration is turned on, regardless of how that individual is defined in an access control list of a database, they have manager rights to the database. And in addition, regardless of reader access fields on a document or a design element, they have access to it. So from an administration's perspective, it's our get out of jail free card. And as a result, you only want to give that to a very small number of people that have the knowledge and also are trusted to work with those types of credentials. Now, they also have your normal administration rights, like, for example, who can use the remote server console and issue commands. And then, of course, we have programmability restrictions. This is the IDs that are allowed to run agents on your Domino server. Now, this is where absolutely you're going to have Domino server groups like local domain servers listed in some of these fields because you want to sign things with the server ID. But you also may have signature ID, user signature IDs as well, and so you want to use those access groups as well. Just be careful, in that when you do set these, that you again set those to the right groups that should have rights, like, for example, sign or run unrestricted methods or operations. You want to make sure, because that can actually do things at the local operating system level of the server. So you want to make sure that that's really IDs that you trust. Also, another thing to note about some of these fields in here is that sometimes no value means nobody can run that type of agent. And for some of these, no value means anybody can run that type of agent. So it's really important that you go in and populate these fields with the correct values. Security settings, compare public keys. This is one where I sometimes run into in larger environments or environments that have been around for a long time. Users don't realize it, but they're using a notes ID that the public or the public key doesn't match what's in their person document, because at some point in time another ID was created for them and issued. And if you're not using encryption in your environment, you're not going to notice it. Well, that's not so much of a big deal, but you can see that if your certifier ID ever became compromised or you had a nefarious actor get a hold of it, then they could create ID files that are then fraudulent and being used in your environment. So by comparing public keys and setting this to an enforced value, you can actually say, I only want to let users get in with the public key that matches what's in the person document. Also, you have the ability to log those public key mismatches. So, like, for example, if you have an environment that's around for a long time, then you can say, I'm thinking about turning on public key checking. But before I actually turn it on and I start locking people out, let me go ahead and turn it on and audit my log files so I can see just how many IDs out there don't match. And then also this one here, checking passwords on notes IDs. Again, this comes down to people having multiple IDs running around. And again, if you have concerns about possibly your certifier being compromised, then you can say, I want to do password checking. Internet authentication. This one here, and I believe this is actually the default value. If you have a web server, you want to use the fewer name variations with higher security, because then that way you're requiring the user to have a username versus a specific username versus any of the possibilities that are available through the combinations in the person document. For server access lists, definitely you want to set these values because, again, just like the programmability restrictions, some of these fields mean nobody gets those rights, and other ones it can be everybody gets those rights, like for example, creating databases on the server. So for accessing the server, I definitely recommend, unless this is a very specific server like hosting a secure application, that you use the option for users listed in all trusted directories. Now keep in mind that when you set this value, then it's very important that here in this other field in the access server area, you list your local domain servers or a group that has just specific servers that should be able to access this server, like for example with replication of documents and databases. Non-access server. So this is who cannot get into your Domino server. What I highly recommend, especially if you're taking over an environment or you're setting up a brand new Domino server environment, is you create at least one group in your address book that is set to a deny only access list type. And then that group is specified here so that when you add people to that group, they are immediately denied access to your Domino server. Another one that I just want to point out here is the trusted servers field. And what the trusted servers field does is it allows other servers, when they're running agents, to do lookups to your server's data. So like, for example, if I have two servers, I have server A and server B. An agent runs on server B, and it's like, oh, I need to go against server A, and I need to get some data out of a database, like, for example, pulling back like a DB lookup and pulling back some values. This is what allows that. So make sure trusted servers, again, is either set to local domain servers or a specific list of servers in your environment that are in a group. All right, moving forward to port settings. Just a couple of comments here. First of all, again, this is a test server I set up, but for the net address, you definitely want to make sure that the net address for this server is a fully qualified domain name that, of course, is going to be represented in your DNS. Like, for example, this. You do not want to list IP addresses because IP addresses can change over time. Also, if you have a Domino cluster, which means that you have two or more servers running in a Domino cluster and they are dynamically exchanging documents in databases, you want to use separate ports. So definitely this is where you would configure those additional ports that you've also have taken care of through your network operating system and making those ports available. For internet ports, you definitely, first of all, want to go to your internet ports. Oops, excuse me. And it's very important right here. Enforce server access settings. By default, these are set to no for both the web server HTTP and then also your mail settings as well. So like, for example, if I have this server running the IMAP task, so I'm serving up mail to an IMAP client, I want to make sure that this gets set to a yes value. Now, by doing that, it causes those protocols running on the Domino server to respect the server's deny access list. So again, you want to set these to yes so that those tasks, like for example, HTTP, IMAP, and POP, respect the server's deny access list, meaning that when you've added somebody to deny access, they are then stopped from using those types of tasks or services on the Domino server. Another thing with regards to web servers is that you want to make sure you set up SSL or TLS so that that information is being served up in an encrypted fashion. Now, we do have some slides later on that talk more specifically about SSL, TLS, and how that gets configured. But what I want to just mention right here is with regards to your TCP/IP port status. And that, yes, I have a TCP/IP port, but anything that comes into that port is automatically redirected to SSL. And it automatically is now going to be encrypted and served over my SSL port, which by default is 443. A couple of other things here just to note is for authentication, I want to authenticate using a name and password, definitely. Now, what's also enabled by default is the ability for an anonymous user to authenticate. From a securities best practices, you actually want to set this to a no value. However, keep in mind that if you also are using the mail redirector database, then you want to set in your notes INI a parameter HTTP public URLs equals and the name of that database, because then those anonymous users that hit that server can still read that database and they can perform authentication. And one other port option I want to mention is here with our SMTP outbound. As in order to do TLS over SMTP for outbound, we want to change this to negotiated SSL, which is definitely something to consider, especially if your Domino server is talking to all different servers in the, all over the world. And there are environments that do require you to talk on SSL. Server tasks. For the server tasks, a couple I want to mention here is, first of all, administration processes. Based on your Domino server, based on what it's doing, the maximum number of threads you may or may not be changing either now or at some point in the future if you notice there's a lot of delays. But the one that I really like to change here is delayed request settings. The delayed request settings are around user renames. So like, for example, I have Mary Smith and she wants to change her name to Mary Jones. Change the name and then requests get written to admin P. And one of those delayed requests is making those changes in any author names fields that she's in. And by default, those only run 1 day a week. Well, if I process Mary's request on Monday morning, she's not going to see that for several days, and that can cause end user confusion. So being that these are not very expensive for the Domino server to run, I like to actually set these to run every day of the week so that way there's more real time in terms of that user name change being propagated across the Domino server environment. Also, with regards to the agent manager, you want to make sure that you set your agent manager correctly. First of all, if this is an application server that has a lot of agents running, then you want to make sure you have the correct number of agents that are allowed to run concurrently. And also, you want to make sure that they are running in the time allotted, because for Lotus Script and JavaScript agents, you as an administrator are saying how much time you're going to allow the server to spend on a particular agent before it shuts it down. And so you want to make sure there is enough time there so the agents that are running business processes and things like that have enough time to run. If this is going to be a web server, you want to think about your Internet Protocols tab. Now, there are a number of these settings that if you have enabled an internet site document, you will not see these fields, okay? But just a couple of ones that I want to mention here is that, first of all, the number of active threads. Again, depending on the amount of volume that's coming in from the web browsers, you may need to change this and increase this value. Now, keep in mind that, just don't say, oh, you know what, I'm going to set this to 1,000. Well, that's actually going to decrease the performance of your Domino server because it's going to allocate those threads and it's going to think it's expecting 1,000 threads. So instead, you actually want to look at information that's available in your statistics table or do capacity planning with your developers and your business owners to actually set a value that makes sense. Also, if this is a mail server, and you have Traveler installed, meaning you're allowing those mobile devices to connect, then the value here should be the number of mobile devices times 1.2. Another really important one that you want to make, now by default, you want to make sure is set properly, is allowing HTTP clients to browse databases. Because if somebody knows the root URL to your Domino server, and this is set to a yes value, they actually can get a list of all of the databases that are available on the Domino server. So it is no by default, but you want to make sure it is indeed set to no so that people cannot just simply go to your Domino server from a web browser and start browsing databases. With regards to server web logging, the Domino server can log out in one of two ways. One is it can log out to these different types of web logs, okay? And when you're writing out that data to these web logs, then that allows you to use third-party product to actually get that information and create charts and graphs and things like that, like usage patterns, redirectional patterns, things like that. Also, if you are wanting to write out to those types of log files, definitely recommend that you specify a directory here. There's also the ability to write out that HTTP traffic information to a DOM log.nsf. Now, if you enable this, then the next time you restart HTTP on your Domino server, it creates a DOM log.nsf. However, keep in mind that that database grows very quickly because any action that occurs through HTTP writes out a document to that database. So it's really important that you go to the replication settings of that database and you say delete documents greater than X number of days old so that that database stays at a manageable size, both with regards to the number of documents and the disk space.
One thing especially happened to me, if you, for example, have a case with HCL support and they tell you to turn on HTTP debugging, then the database becomes huge in a very short time frame. So you may want to turn on HTTP debugging, but as soon as you fix your issues, turn it off, otherwise the database becomes literally unmanageable.
Right, I agree, absolutely. Okay, HTTP persistent connections. Just like other web servers, this is your keep alive. So basically, by default, Domino is set to keep alive connections versus creating a new connection when there are new requests or responses. Now, you would think that that actually makes sense, and logically it kind of does, but in reality, for Domino, the cost of establishing a connection is really low. And depending on the network connectivity of that Domino server and the volume on that Domino server, it may actually be more expensive for that Domino server to do the polling that is part of persistent connections. So as a best practice, when you consider Domino web server performance, this actually should be a disabled value. And then with the Domino web engine, the one field I want to mention here is the posting of data and the maximum post data. And this basically is then saying for a document, what is the largest size of a document that I'm going to allow to be created through the Domino or through a web browser client. All right, so now moving over to some more advanced tasks, transactional logging. Transactional logging, just like other server systems that are out there, when you have transactional logging enabled in Domino, then anything that's being done on that Domino server, like document updates, those are being written to the transactional log, and then when the server has the ability or availability, it writes out that change actually at the database document level. So ultimately, by enabling transaction logging on your Domino server, you can increase performance of the Domino server, and of course also that becomes a reality to the users and that the Domino server is working faster and serving up data to them faster. Now, when you enable transactional logging on a Domino server, there's some specific things you want to keep in mind. First of all, is where is that transaction log being stored? By default, it's going to be stored in your Domino data folder. And because of disk I/O and other considerations, you don't want to do that. Definitely you want to move this off to another logical path. Like for example, on your Domino server, you get another volume, and I'm just going to use Windows as the example here. I get a volume that's called the H drive. And on that H drive, I then define where it's going to go. So like h:/log_dir. So that's the directory it's going to go into on the log directory, or in the H directory. Also, you need to think about what type of logging style. There's three options here. Circular and linear are very similar in that what that means is information is written out to the log file, and then once that log file hits its maximum size, the oldest information is going to be overwritten. So you only have one log file that you're, have to back up. So you need to make sure that that transaction log is getting backed up before it starts getting overwritten again. And then that way you can do things like your snapshot backups, and you can do your playbacks off of the transaction log if there's a problem with the database. However, if you have a really busy server, there's a lot of volume, and that's where you may want to think about doing archived logging. Okay, and with archive logging, then you actually have transaction logs being created. They're TXN files on your log, TXN logs, but you have to make sure that you have backup software that knows how to back up those transaction logs and flip a bit so that the Domino server knows that that transaction log's been backed up, and it can then overwrite it and reuse that space. So if you are not using a backup software that's properly configured and backing up your archived transaction logs properly, you're just going to see TXNs getting created one after another and pretty soon run out of disk space. So definitely be cognizant of that. Another thing too about circular and linear, I just want to point out, is circular logs are going to be between 500 megabytes and 4 gigabytes in size, where if you have a need for a log file to be bigger than 4 gigabytes, then that's where you want to go to your linear log. Now, another thing too, in terms of just managing a Domino server that has transactional logging enabled, is first of all, databases now have what's known as a database instant ID. And that is used by the transaction log to basically do snapshots and to know the snapshot data and perform replays as needed for restore purposes. So you want to make sure that you are backing up your transaction logs appropriately based on what's happening on your Domino server. Because if you change your transaction log style, or you run certain tasks against your Domino databases, like Compact, that is going to change the database instance ID. And at that point, then, you need to do a full backup of your Domino server, because all of that information in the transaction log is now going to have new database instance ID information. Okay? And another thing, too, about managing Domino servers, we're going to talk about this later when we get into program documents as well, but you just want to think about the types of maintenance tasks you're running against those databases so that you aren't changing those database instance IDs without also planning a full backup. And then, similar to transaction logging, another advanced task is DAOS. Now, DAOS requires transaction logging. So you can't do transaction log, or you can't do DAOS unless you already have transaction logging enabled on the server. DAOS is an acronym for Domino Attachment Object Services. And specifically, what that means is when I have DAOS enabled on my Domino server, file attachments that are sent by mail to more than one user can be moved into the DAOS system. So ultimately, the mail message is stored in each person's mail file without the file attachment. The file attachment is stored as an LLO. And by enabling this, very similar to transaction logging, I get additional fields, and I can now set up some information. Like, for example, I set up the size of those attachments that should be considered for moving out of those mail messages. And there's a really cool utility called the DAOS Estimator utility. You can run it against your mail files, and it'll give you the information about those existing file attachments so that you can make the best decision for setting this maximum size here, or minimum size, excuse me. The other thing too that's available in DAOS is the ability to move attachments or the NLO files that haven't been accessed for a particular period of time to tier 2 storage by using S3 drives. And then finally, I also just want to mention real quick about Traveler. Traveler is where, if this is a mail server, you can allow your users to have their mail files or mail file data on their mobile device, like an iPhone or an Android. And when you have Traveler installed on a Domino server and you're allowing your users to do that, a couple of things you want to consider is, first of all, the access list. Do you want to control who can access this Domino server through Traveler? Also, you want to make sure that you perhaps have a not access list as well. Outside of this server document configuration, just some other things to consider with Traveler is I definitely recommend that you think about a mobile device management software or appliance, like for example, AirWatch. So it's a device or a server that's sitting in front of your Traveler server and controlling the security of what's allowed to pass through into your environment. And then also, because mail is often considered to be mission critical, with Traveler, think about high availability pools, and that you can have multiple Domino servers with Traveler installed, and they basically are acting as one unit, just like Domino clusters do, for example, so that your users, regardless of what server is up, they can still get to their mail data. All right, configuration documents. Very similar to the server document. It's just another place to think about in terms of configuring Domino. First of all is some security settings, in that this is how, when web browsers authenticate, you think about where is that password that they need to access, okay? Now, by default, it's the internet password stored in the person document that's in the address book. However, my recommendation is to change this to check vault first, then directory. What that does is the dominant, when a request comes in under HTTP, it's going to first go to the ID vault and see if there's an entry for that user and use the password that's part of that notes ID that's stored in the ID vault. But if there's not a document there, then it'll fail back to the default of using what's in the person document. Also, you have the ability to stop brute force attacks, and that if I set enforce internet password lockout to a yes value, then I can say if somebody is trying to get in with a particular username more than X number of times, then lock them out for a particular amount of time. So again, you're stopping brute force attacks by doing that. For messaging, definitely consider changing this to more than one, like for example, 2. This is the number of mailboxes that get created on your Domino server. So if one of the mailboxes becomes corrupt, then you at least have another mailbox that the Domino server can use. Also, for addressing lookups, I like to change this to full name only, so that basically I'm only using what's in the full name field and the internet address field versus any of the names values that are available on the person document. And also, if your Domino server is sitting behind your firewall and you have like another messaging system that's your primary messaging system, then consider using a relay server so that your Domino server's exposure is minimized and you're relaying all of your mail messages through that relay host. Also, maximum message size to basically prevent yourself from having email storms created because somebody sent out a large file attachment to other environments and now they're bouncing email back to you, and that's possibly bouncing around in your own environment. Create or set your maximum message size to a value that makes sense for your environment. Okay, SMTP controls. A really great one to consider here is these deny messages to be sent to external domains, and setting both this one and this field to an asterisk, and then that way all are going to be denied. Okay. However, you can exclude these connection hosts from anti-relay checks. So if you have a server in your environment that you want to allow to relay through Domino, then you can set that here. However, just keep in mind that if you're using an IP address, you want to make sure that that IP is in brackets. Okay. And then again, like I was talking about, if you have your Domino server behind a firewall, then you can use these connection controls to actually allow your SMTP inbound connections from a particular host. All right, some other things to consider on mail. First of all, you have the ability Hold on just one second. I got thrown off for just a moment here. You have the ability to control forwarding of emails. You know, from a business purpose, it actually makes sense for people to be able to forward emails. Like, for example, I'm going to be out for a week, so I want to allow emails to get forwarded automatically to a business, to a coworker. But do you really want people forwarding out to other domains? So this field right here, in that you can very easily say, I want to stop forwarding emails to external internal domains or external internet domains. And then message tracking. Love message tracking. By default, it's disabled, but turn it on. And then that way you can use the message tracking utility that's available in Domino to manage emails or to find out what's happened to emails in your environment, if they were delivered, things like that. Journaling, do not turn on unless you absolutely have to, and call me if you need to turn that on because you want to make sure it's done properly. Extensions here, right here, SSL negotiated. We were talking about SSL and TLS. This right here, if this is turned on, then as an enabled, then what's going to happen is for inbound SMTP, your server can talk on TLS. And then another one that I like to turn on is the ability of the Domino server to, first of all, do out of office instead of doing the traditional agent, go to service. And then finally, enabling the server's ability to automatically take care of undeliverable mail. So it does that cleanup. So those things just don't sit in the mail.boxes boxes on the server. All right, another really good one here that I want to mention real quick is the Notes INI. Why you want to use the Notes INI tab on the server document versus just putting things directly into the server's INI is because when things are in the server's INI, that's just a text file that's sitting on the Domino server. If something happens to your Domino server, or if you're looking to move that Domino server to new hardware or new VM, you need to reapply all those INI changes. By putting them here in the configuration document, they stay. And as a result, you don't have to move things when you change your Domino server to a new platform, to a new VM, for example. And in the PowerPoint presentation, we actually have a number of INIs that are recommended. We'll go all of these INIs. Depending again on the purpose of your Domino server, we recommend these get set either at the initial deployment time or at some point during the life of your server based on what's happening. I don't have time to go over them all right now, but they are all defined in HCL documentation, and there's a lot of great information out there on those. And of course, you have questions, you can definitely ask. Okay. So with that, Roberto, I'm going to turn it over to you for discussing some SSL tricks.
Thanks. As Heather said, SSL is basically mandatory nowadays. Some things will not even work without SSL. For example, the latest version of the Traveler client on mobile device. Soon, also the Sometime mobile client will stop supporting HTTP, so only HTTPS. And if you use Verse for reading your mail with the browser, is mandatory. Verse does not work with the URL like HTTP mymailserver/Verse. So the first thing we suggest, as Heather showed, is to enable HTTP, but redirect to SSL and enforce the server access settings. Add also 2 lines to .ini, disable SSL v3 = 1 and SSL disable TLS 10 = 1. Actually, the first one now is by default. I mean, SSL v3 is disabled by default on Domino, but if you have an old version of Domino, like release 9, release 8, you have to put that in the Notes INI. So this will only enable TLS 1.2, which is the latest version that Domino supports. One other suggestion is to disable the weak ciphers. When you go into the ports settings, you can select which kind of ciphers to enable. So my suggestion is just to select the first 5, 6 and get rid of all the other one because they're weak. And we do not use anymore the old SSL cipher spec equal that long string in the node.sign AI. Just do it from the server document. Next, please, how to set up SSL. Up until V11, do not use the Domino CA application. That's good for creating Domino certificates, registering people, but not for X509 certificate. Use OpenSSL and Tier 2. There are 3 ways, basically, to do that. I put a link to a couple of excellent documents from HCL support. One is how to create a self-signed certificate, which can be good for testing. I mean, you're developing an app and that has to be used by a browser, and you want to test it. You don't want to spend money and buy a proper certificate. Just create a self-signed so you can do your checks. Obviously, the only thing that will happen is that the first time you hit with the browser, it will tell you connection is not trusted, blah, blah, blah. You say, go on, and it will work. For production, obviously, you want to use a proper certificate obtained by a certification authority like DigiCert, Komodo, whatever. And that second link points you to the procedure, which is slightly different from the one above, on how to create the Domino keyring file with the certificate using this third-party certificate. The third option, there is a free Domino application from a business partner in Germany, Midpoint, that's called LE4D, that lets you request and renew SSL certificate issued by Let's Encrypt. Let's Encrypt has one advantage and one disadvantage. The advantage is that those certificates are free. The disadvantage is that by default, a certificate expiration is 1 year, but the Let's Encrypt certificate is 3 months. But you don't have to worry about that because the LE4D application, which is very easy to set up, will also generate the new request for renewing the certificate after a specified time. Let's say 20 days before the certificate expires, make a new request and renew the certificate. So it's all automatic. And this is the way to go if you're running up to version 11. Next slide. If you want to set up SSL in V12, as I said, it's a piece of cake. You have to use the new database of the certification manager that's been written from scratch, and it's completely new in V12. Basically, it does the same things as the LE4D. The idea is that you define what CA you want to work with, it issued the request, thinks about the renewal, etc. And next June, which is 1 month from today, we will have a webinar about this specific feature because it's so huge that it deserves a webinar dedicated only to that. So Daniel Nashed, which is the guru, will explain us all the inner works in how it works and good and the bad and the ugly of the new certification manager DB. Next, disabled not use of ports. Because, okay, it's fine to set SSL for the ports if you want. But if you do not use IMAP or POP, simply disable the port. It will reduce the risk of someone trying to do an attack on this specific port. You don't need it, don't use it. The example is for bail, but if you look at the tabs up, Same goes for the IOP, directory, web, etc. If there is something that you don't use, disable it. And as Heather said, use negotiated TLS when sending outbound. Recently, I had a customer who didn't use it, and all of a sudden, all the emails that he wanted to exchange with a partner of his business got rejected because their server required that settings. Next, just one last thing, the whitelist active content filter for notes and verse. Because being a browser, the tool that you use to read an email, it's exposed to potential harmful active content hidden in a HTML message like JavaScript or these kind of things. Using the whitelist filter, remove all the stuff there and lets you be more safe. Next, I think we're last. So yes, I think we'll pass it over to Serdar for his tips and tricks for developers.
Okay, sounds great.
Okay, thanks, Roberto and Heather. That was great. I wrote down some tips as you guys were going through, and I've been doing this for 30 years. Serdar, I'm going to make you the presenter.
Ready? Yes. Can you see my screen?
Yep, we see
it. It's a great OpenNTF screen, yeah? Okay.
Yeah.
Let's get started with some tips and tricks for Domino environments. Oops. Yeah. So hello everyone, and in this part I will be using my Half-Blood admin superpowers to talk about some admin practices around test and development servers. And apart from my developer life, in fact, I provided second-level support for some customers with their own developers, especially X-based developers and those dealing with plugins or RESTful services, Java, etc. They need some basic abilities to at least to manage their own local servers. So, of course, in my experience, many developers have enough knowledge about basic administration, but even so, I compile some tips and tricks mostly based on my observations and questions I received from developers. And before starting, let me remind that it's different from Heather and Roberto. Most of the things I'm going to talk about, they are not the best approach for the production environment, only used for your own environments. And that said, let's get started with the first topic, authentication. Okay, most of the time, we don't really care what kind of authentication our production uses, especially after version 9. This topic becomes a separate expertise for admins as well. But sometimes we need to replicate some or the same or similar capability into our test and development servers. And for instance, we might need to design a logout button or provide service for more peculiar types of situations like RESTful services, etc. And among all options, today I'm going to concentrate into two main types of authentication. One is simple basic authentication, which is the default and the oldest form of stateless username password authentication. And the other one is session authentication, where Domino supports two types of architectures here, and we will talk about it in a minute. There are, of course, more complicated mechanisms out there. SAML is completely different story, and we probably need a whole new dedicated session for OAuth or IAM. They are not for today. And as I said, basic authentication is the simplest form of authentication, and it relies heavily on the client to remember the password. And in web applications, the client means the browser. And when the browser hits a protected resource, it gets usual 401 unauthorized status with a specific header, and browser will know that it has to ask credential to the user and build those credentials into a header value and sends them back to the server. This is not a secret thing. This can be decoded very easily, and it adds the same value, the same header value to every single request, as long as you request a protected resource from the same realm, and as long as Domino server thinks that you are authorized to see that resource, until of course we close the browser session. And as you might imagine, this is probably the most insecure way to handle this kind of situation. But anyway, it's there, it's simple, it can be used for many purposes, and we are going to use it. The second type is a more modern approach, where we established a user session on authentication. Again, the browser hit a protected resource on the server, and this time it gets a different response from the server. It's a login form with a 200 OK message. And here is the one challenge for the Domino server. In up there world, we expect a 401 code in such situation, because we don't have authentication, we don't have a permission to see that resource, but we'll talk about it later. The login form simply submits the username, the password, and the original requested site to a special address on the Domino server, and if everything is fine, server will send the requested page with an authentication cookie in the end, and this cookie will be used to authenticate our browser session for further subsequent requests. As you know, there are two types of session authentication in Domino, and in fact, both types execute exactly the same scenario in the login process. One difference, though, is the cookie. In single server scenario, the session cookie is just a session ID. And because in this scenario, the server is responsible keeping track of all sessions, therefore the cookie is valid for only a single server, as its name suggests. On the other hand, in multi-server scenario, the cookie is itself self-contained. It has everything it needs for a session. It stores the username, the creation, expiration dates, times, and they are all hashed with a secret only known to the Domino server. And therefore, this LTPA token is verifiable by multiple servers independently. And that puts this type of authentication into SSO category, I mean, single sign-on. So multiple servers can create the LTPA token, and those tokens will be verifiable. That's an important thing to remember in this kind of scenario. To sum up these three, we can now respond to most frequently asked questions from my developer friends. These cookies are different. You may need it on your applications. And in fact, one is just the session ID, the other is the whole token. And most questions are about the expiration and timeouts. For sure, authentication has to expire after a certain time, and for basic authentication, it's simple. It never expires until you quit from the browser. But in single server, it's conveniently stored on the server, and there's an idle timeout since the last request. That's important, since the last request. But for multiple servers, the cookie contains the token, thus the expiration info, and cannot be further changed. So the cookie creation time is important. We'll come to that. Another difference, perhaps, we can always see a list of active sessions accurately on single server scenario, but on multi-server scenario, this list will not be that much accurate. And if HTTP restarts, the basic and multi-server authentications will continue, but single server case, all sessions will be invalidated at the server. The first problem we mentioned here, the server responds success message in an unauthenticated or unauthorized response. This is an important complication for your applications, especially when you design a RESTful service or client-side JavaScript, because ready-to-use libraries, they all assume 200 as a success message, and they handle those responses as a successful response. So you might overwrite session authentication for specific patterns, and I strongly suggest that, and continue with basic for those services. Of course, ideally, you should better use IAM or OAuth for that, but it's not our scope today. Another important difference, this is coming too much as a question, you can't really kick out a single sign-on user. You can't renew their sessions as well. They will expire when they will expire. And they will expire in the middle of everything, in the middle of the day, and nobody can change that. That's why we generally keep 8 to 10 hours of for the token expiration, which is not greatest practice, but this is much better than users with session expiring in the middle of the day. One reminder here for X-Base developers, this is a very common misconception. What we are talking about session, authentication session, we are not talking about the X-Base session. These are different things. X-Base session is tracked by a session ID cookie. It's specific to browser session. It's not specific to user. And even in a browser, if you change the user authentication, I mean logout and login with different users, sometimes it confuses sessions, and sessions will be leaked into each other. That's going to be a problem. Apart from authentication, I'll share a couple of small tips around various topics here. First, in our own platforms, I strongly suggest using internet sites, because these sites documents has additional settings, and they allow multiple domain setup. So they are much better suited for testing. For example, there is a method to disable or enable allowed methods for HTTP. We can use them for RESTful development. And this is normally adjusted by a nodes INI setting, but you can't see on the web configuration view, I mean in the server configuration. But in the internet sites, you can use internet site document to modify these values. In X-Base application, we use XSP properties for many settings per applications, and when you need those settings in the server-wide as a server-wide setting to apply all databases at once, there is a properties file in the data folder, and it's very useful. And there is a sample file as well, which contains a full reference of settings documented in great detail, and it's a great resource. Heather mentioned about this setting, but I would like to underline that again, because one architecture in X-Pages is dividing the front-end X-Base application and the NSF backend data. And in fact, this would be more useful than you think, and especially regarding cloud environments or auto deployment for apps would be possible in the future. Moreover, you can even put your data NSF in a different server, which is not practical, of course, for production. The performance will be low. However, sometimes I find it very useful. For instance, when my customer has 40 gigs of data on their server, and I need to access that data from my testing application, and I can use it for testing purposes. But to do that in security type of the server document setting, I need to add my server to trusted servers of the target server, and that would be useful for some cases. We like debugging. We debug all the time, and here are some different debug options for HTTP threads. I find them very useful because they contain very valuable information, including timing for how thread processes the requests. One less known feature here, there is an additional option to keep only the latest request log. And sometimes I keep this option enabled on my development server so I can analyze what's going on under the hood immediately after I see an error. Speaking about debugging, this is one of the greatest and most underrated tools in the OpenNTF, and you should keep it on your test and development servers all the time, and not on production servers, please. So you don't need to stay connected to your remote servers every time you need a log entry. And thank you, Jacob, for that great tool. Send him your virtual kudos. HTTP JVM's heap size is an important parameter for performance and scalability. This was a huge issue in the old times. One less known fact here is that there are two JVM heap size settings because there are two JVMs on Domino servers, and HTTP uses a different one. So non-HTTP JVM can also be adjusted with a different settings. And next time your Java agent fails with an out of memory error, please remember this setting. Meanwhile, for JVM, you can add some JVM directives for your server. And I use this a lot to change locale, to enable some additional debugging at the Java level, at the Java library level, or sometimes to configure or tweak my third-party libraries. And this is very useful. And also, you know, java.policy file, I see a lot of people modifying this file, but it's not, we are not supposed to modify this file anymore because Java policy file is the JVM default, and it will be replaced every reinstall or upgrade operation. And in addition, in recent versions, it causes other issues during the installation process. So add your custom settings into java.pol file in the same folder, and you can refer to the tech notes, to the related tech note for other options you have. Let's finish with a couple of security tips. One thing is HTTP enable connector heading, connector headings parameter. This brought up by Jesper a couple of years ago, I guess, but this parameter is being used a lot. But this is basically for Domino behind a proxy scenario. So there is a number of things that can be done with this. The problem that it also allows an attacker to impersonate any user. That's something we don't want. Even for a development server, do not left it insecure without a firewall if you are really going to use it. Sometimes I see test and development servers in the same domain with the production system. This is not a technical issue, and I understand that this is a great ease of management for people, for admins, for developers, etc. However, this is not a good practice for security, especially in testing systems. We have test users in test groups, etc. And in a single domain settings in a configuration, these settings might leak. You can you can leave a test user with a simple password open on the production server, so they would create a breach on your production. So divide it if you can. And I see a lot of cases where the testing server or UAT servers are wide open for breach. People don't care about them because I think people think they don't have real data, so it's not big security deal. But remember, as a developer, these servers contain valuable intel about your production system, so they should be secured well behind firewalls and VPNs all the time. And with that, we can finish this part and get to the Q&A.
Thank you, Sidar. Based on the amount of time that we have left and the number of questions that we have, I think we're not going to get to them all. So we'll do our best. And as we have with a couple of previous webinars, we'll take all of the questions and have them answered and posted in a blog post. But having said that, Howard, shall we jump in?
Sure, sounds great, Graham. Go ahead.
Okay, so our first question. Yeah, first question came before we even started talking, which is for the entire admin group. Is it easy to scrap and then rebuild an ID vault in Domino?
I've never had to do that, so I can't say for sure. I mean, I'm just off the top of my head. Yes, you probably can scrap it because you're just deleting it, and then you can go through the process of recreating it where it's going to create the database. It's going to create that vault ID. And then, of course, you can start getting your new, from your users, you can get your IDs in there. Although you have to think about as far as your onboarding process, and when you create users, it places your people in there. So not necessarily a best practice. It's not something I would recommend doing.
Okay.
Roberto, do you have any other thoughts, or John?
Yeah, let me add to that. One of the first things I'd say for all admins is when you're first setting up your environment, please make sure you create an ID vault right from the scratch, and also create a replica of the ID vault. I'm not sure if that question is about someone who's lost the ID vault and didn't have a backup and they're wondering if they can rebuild it. It's meant to be very, very secure. So if you actually end up losing your only copy of the ID vault, you're probably going to have to start from scratch and generate a new ID vault, and that's by design. We don't want somebody to be able to do that easily. But definitely, with all the things happening with Nomad for mobile and then Nomad Web coming up, you really want to have that ID vault configured and have all your users' IDs harvested and check on it to make sure that's running well. There's a lot of nice tools in there to do it, and that also gives you a backup of the user's ID. I'm the help desk in our environment. Their laptops crashed. They didn't have a backup of their ID anywhere but on their machine, and now they have to figure out a way to get back in. And having it in the ID vault makes your life as an admin a lot easier, and it's very secure. And I want to reiterate for those certs and the org certs and the make backups. Put them in a notes database somewhere where you have multiple replicas, and save the password with the particular IDs, because that's another one that it's a nightmare if you lose either or and to get them back.
Thanks, John. So we have another question from Pop. piece. They're asking, can the notes client connect to the Domino server if the Domino server is on an OpenShift container that has port 1352 exposed in a reverse proxy way? Just wondering if anyone's tried that. I guess the answer is no.
I haven't tried it. We can certainly get a quick answer when I chat with Daniel Nash. He's been doing a lot of work with Docker. I'm becoming a little bit more familiar with it as we go. It's very nice to have, but the ease of access of using Docker is easy. But we'll get you a definitive answer in a follow-up.
Thanks, John.
Okay, next question then. What tool do you use to analyze NSDs and crashes?
My eyes.
Yeah, that's exactly what I use.
I know there was a tool at one point that Lotus Support had. Unfortunately, the tool didn't make its way across. Maybe at some point we can convince Ken Brunson to do a webinar on NSD and just to give admins
I have that tool, and
yeah,
I find it extremely useful.
Right. The key things in an NSD obviously are what PID and TID crashed and the call stack of the PID and TID. And a lot of the other information is very relevant, especially if you have a hang and you took a manual NSD. Again, working in development, we have new code, we have crashes and hangs and things all the time. And yes, we're very good at seeing, oh, it happened. I like to line up the NSD with the console log and see if I can isolate exactly what user, what database. And many times I get to go in live with the debugger, but I want to validate that if I didn't have that capability of going in and attaching the debugger, could the NSD have given me enough information from a serviceability point of view to gather that info and debug the customer's problems? And it's pretty good. It's really very good. But I understand from an end user or an admin's perspective, there's a lot of stuff in there, and maybe we can make it a little bit easier so you don't have to go to support to figure out, why this has crashed. I encourage using the fault analyzer task so that you can measure in your environment and set up fault data collection, as Heather had mentioned, so that you can see, out of the 100 crashes in my environment that I had in the last year, 56 of them were the same crash. So that's the one I want to make the highest priority, through support. But we want to hear about any and all crashes, because nothing should bring down the client or the server. And NSD is our frontline mechanism for troubleshooting those crashes.
Thanks, John.
Yeah, for instance, a semaphore debug file needs to be decoded to time ticks, from time ticks to seconds. So that tool was doing that without importing in a log into fault analyzer, etc. That kind of small tricks were quite useful in that tool. I don't remember its name, by the way.
Yeah, and I know you guys are aware that, well, maybe some people aren't, that Louis Guergue is heading up what's called HCL Academy. And there's going to be a lot of good courses and classes in there. And and they're looking for content. And I'll actually make a recommendation to them that we have an NSD course in there and again, see what tools we can continue to add, and obviously our support team wants to be able to analyze NSDs quickly. But I had asked previously if that tool that we had once had in support had made it across, and we couldn't find it anywhere. If anyone has it and they want to send it to me, we'd love to figure out, where the source code was for it and enhance upon it. But
All right, thanks, John. Let's move on. A question from Martin. Do you recommend a different notes network port for clustering traffic?
Yes.
well, I'll be honest. I mean, you can use both. It all depends on your environment, your bandwidth,
Exactly.
what you're
Yes.
seeing.
Size of the environment.
You don't want to do overkill. Like in our environment, we only have 1,000 users, and again, some people that's a lot. But if you have tens of thousands or 100,000s, which some environments have, and the type of activity that's going on, can that single network port handle the cluster replication is the big question, right? If you do it on a separate port and you have more bandwidth, you can make sure things, you don't want things arriving in a cluster mate, you know, you want it arriving in 5 seconds, not 5 minutes, just in case something goes wrong in that 5 minutes. So it's a way of measuring. Either will work, and again, based on the load and what type of activity you're seeing and how quickly things are being pushed to the cluster mates, will determine if you need that extra port and should configure it.
Okay, we have 1 minute left. I think clearly, as I said before, we'll take all of the questions that have been asked and get them answered and then get them posted on our blog. I'll just jump ahead to one here that is a clarifying question, which is let's encrypt for Domino. Is LE40 going to be part of Domino 12? I think it was mentioned in the presentation that there was a new tool that was different.
No, not the proper LE40 by midpoints, but the new certification manager application, and we will talk about that, does the same thing, but it does more. LE4D works only for Let's Encrypt, while the new certification manager works for every CA that you want to interact with. So the answer is no and yes. The LE4D, no. Yes, the new sub manager will do the same stuff and much more.
Right, and for all of our customers, the V12 beta is available to you. You can go in and register for it and get into the forum and get the access to the documentation on the cert manager, and you can actually see everybody's feedback, which has been outstanding. They really gave the team a lot of great feedback that was incorporated in the beta, and they're very pleased at the ease of use of the new cert manager to cut down on one more headache. It's one headache I don't want. I don't want to have to use that keyring tool and go in there. It's a nightmare for me. My brother's better at it. He's on the security team. But I just want to set something up and say, give me a certificate for this server, and boom, it just gets done. It goes off and talks to whatever certifier you have, and it comes back and everything's set up and configured, and the servers can start accessing it. So it's a beautiful enhancement.
Excellent. I think we should wrap there, Howard, and again, remind everybody to watch for our blog post on all of the questions for today. Thanks, everybody.
Okay, thank you, everyone. Well, it's a very informative webinar. Lots of good questions we'll post up, and I'd like to especially thank our panel today, John, Roberto, Serdar, and Heather, for a really great presentation. Until next month, everyone have a great rest of your day.